Hello everyone, I hope you're all well. Welcome to part 3 of the Twits. If you've missed parts 1 and 2, they're already on our YouTube channel. You should be able to find them quite easily. If you've got a copy of the book at home and you want to read along, you can pause the video and go and find the book now. I'm just about to start the chapter called Mrs Twit Has the Shrinks. Mr and Mrs Twit have been playing horrible tricks on each other and I think they're getting worse and worse. Let's find out what happens in this chapter. As soon as Mrs Twit sat down, Mr Twit pointed at her and shouted, "There you are! You're sitting on your old chair and you shrunk so much your feet aren't even touching the ground." Mrs Twit looked down at her feet, and by golly, the man was right. Her feet were not touching the ground. Mr Twit, you see, had been just as clever with the chair as he had been with the walking stick. Every night when he'd gone downstairs and stuck a little bit extra onto the stick, he'd also done the same to the forelegs of Mrs Twit's chair. "Just look at you sitting there in your same old chair," he cried, "and you shrunk so much your feet are dangling in the air." Mrs Twit went white with fear. "You've got the shrinks," cried Mr Twit, pointing his finger at her like a pistol. "You've got them badly. You've got the most terrible case of shrinks I've ever seen." Mrs Twit became so frightened she began to dribble. But Mr Twit, still remembering the worms in his spaghetti, didn't feel sorry for her at all. "I suppose you know what happens to you when you get the shrinks," he said. "What?" gasped Mrs Twit. "What happens?" "Well, your head shrinks into your neck, and your neck shrinks into your body, and your body shrinks into your legs, and your legs shrink into your feet. And in the end, there's nothing left except a pair of shoes and a bundle of old clothes." "I can't bear it!" cried Mrs Twit. It's a terrible disease," said Mr Twit, "the worst in the world." "How long have I got?" cried Mrs Twit. "How long before I finish up as a bundle of old clothes and a pair of shoes?" Mr Twit put on a very solemn face. "At the rate you're going," he said, shaking his head sadly, "I'd say not more than 10 or 11 days. "But isn't there anything we can do?" cried Mrs Twit. "There's only one cure for the shrinks," said Mr Twit. "Tell me!" she cried. "Oh, tell me quickly!" "Well, we have to hurry," said Mr Twit. "I'm ready, I'll hurry. I'll do anything you want," cried Mrs Twit. "You won't last long if you don't," said Mr Twit, giving her another grisly grin. "What is it I must do?" cried Mrs Twit, clutching her cheeks. "Ooh. You've got to be stretched," said Mr Twit. Mrs Twit gets a stretching. Mr Twit led Mrs Twit outdoors where he had everything ready for the great stretching. He had 100 balloons and lots of string. He had a gas cylinder for filling the balloons. He had fixed an iron ring into the ground. "Stand here," he said, pointing to the iron ring. When that was done, he began filling the balloons with gas. Each balloon was on a long string, and when it was filled with gas, it pulled on its string, trying to go up and up. Mr Twit tied the ends of the strings to the top half of Mrs Twit's body. Some he tied around her neck, some under her arms, some to her wrists, and some even to her hair. Soon there were 50 coloured balloons floating in the air above Mr Twit's head. "Can you feel them stretching you?" asked Mr Twit. I can, cried Mrs Twit. "They're stretching me like mad." He put on another 10 balloons. The upward pull became very strong, as you can see. Mrs Twit was quite helpless now. With her feet tied to the ground and her arms pulled upwards by the balloons, she was unable to move. She was a prisoner. And Mr Twit had intended to go away and leave her like that to teach her a lesson for a couple of days and nights. In fact, he was just about to leave when Mrs. Twit opened her big mouth and said something silly. "Are you sure my feet are tied properly to the ground?" she gasped. "If those strings around my ankles break, it'll be goodbye for me." And that's what gave Mr. Twit his second nasty idea. Mrs. Twit goes ballooning up. "There's enough pull here to take me to the moon!" cried Mrs. Twit. "To take you to the moon?" exclaimed Mr. Twit. "What a ghastly thought! We wouldn't want anything like that to happen. Oh dear me, no." "We most certainly wouldn't," cried Mrs. Twit. "Put some more string around my ankles quickly. I want to feel absolutely safe." Uh-oh, and I think that picture gives away what's going to happen. "Very well, my angel," said Mr. Twit, and with a ghoulish grin on his lips, he knelt down at her feet. He took a knife from his pocket, and with one quick slash, he cut through the strings holding Mrs. Twit's ankles to the iron ring. She went up like a rocket. "Help!" she screamed. "Save me!" But there was no saving her now. In a few seconds, she was high up in the blue sky and climbing fast. Mr. Twit stood below, looking up. "What a pretty sight," he said to himself. "How lovely all those balloons look in the sky. And what a marvellous bit of luck for me. At last, the old hag is gone and lost forever." Mrs. Twit comes ballooning down. Mrs. Twit may have been ugly and she may have been beastly, but she was not stupid. High up there in the sky, she had a bright idea. "If I can get rid of some of these balloons," she said to herself, "I will stop going up and start coming down." She began biting through the strings that held the balloons to her wrists and arms and neck and hair. Each time she bit through a string and let the balloon float away, the upward pull got less and her rate of climb slowed down. When she'd bitten through 20 strings, she stopped going up altogether. She stayed still in the air. She bit through one more string. Very, very slowly, she began to float downwards. It was a calm day. There was no wind at all, and because of this, Mrs. Twit had gone absolutely straight up. She now began to come absolutely straight down. As she floated gently down, Mrs. Twit's petticoat billowed out like a parachute, showing her long knickers. It was a grand sight on a glorious day, and thousands of birds came flying in from miles around to stare at this extraordinary woman in the sky. Mr. Twit gets a horrid shock. Mr. Twit, who thought he'd seen his ugly wife for the last time, was sitting in the garden celebrating with a mug of beer. Silently, Mrs. Twit came floating down. When she was about the height of the house above Mr. Twit, she suddenly called out at the top of her voice, "Here I come, you grisly old grunion, you rotten old turnip, you filthy old trumpet." Mr. Twit jumped as though he'd been stung by a giant wasp. He dropped his beer, he looked up, he gaped, he gasped, he gurgled. A few choking sounds came out of his mouth. "Ugh," he said. "Ugh." "I'll get you for this," shouted Mrs. Twit. She was floating down right on top of him. She was purple with rage and slashing the air with her long walking stick, which she had somehow managed to hang on to all the time. "I'll swish you to a swazzle," she shouted. "I'll swash you to a swizzle. I'll nash you to a nuzzle. I'll nosh you to a nazzle." And before Mr. Twit had time to run away, this bundle of balloons and petticoats and fiery fury landed right on top of him, lashing out with the stick and cracking him all over his body. Well, what an end to that chapter. See you next time. Bye for now.